help us to distinguish between Lord's Supper passages and common meal passages. We noted in Acts 2 and verse 42, breaking bread is breaking the bread, as opposed to Acts 2 and verse 46, where breaking bread is simply a common meal. We noted breaking the bread in Acts 20 verse 7 refers to the Lord's Supper. It was not simply a gathering to eat. And so we're looking at the distinctions to know the difference between a common meal and the Lord's Supper. And now I want to think, as we close and try to get into the next lesson, looking at some of the matters pertaining to the Lord's Supper itself, and some things that are oftentimes misunderstood, beginning in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 27, where Paul says, after giving the instructions that he himself had received from the Lord, he says, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. And for this reason, that's going to be an important passage to consider in a moment. For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. But if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. And if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment. And the rest I will set in order when I come. So Paul makes some fairly straightforward statements about the importance of the Lord's Supper. Now, this is one area that distinguishes the churches of Christ from pretty much every other religious institution, and that is the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. Now, we know that there are some groups, for example, Roman Catholicism has a weekly Mass. Sometimes they'll have it on Saturday and or Sunday, or at other times. But it's not held in high regard, generally speaking, by the membership at large. Whereas among the churches of Christ, there is a focus, I think, that is given with reference to the Lord's Supper, and so it's important for us to be able to speak to these things and to be able to answer questions about such things. For example, last week we made mention of the fact that it's obvious, even in any casual reading of the text, that the church observed the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. Every first day of the week. And I made mention, and you can check me on this, read any standard commentary written by any commentator of any religious stripe, and they will all tell you that the early church observed the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. And yet that's not the case with nearly any of them now. And there might be an annual observance. There might be a quarterly observance. I don't know, just whatever they decide is what is done. And there's no biblical precedent for that. There's no authority for that. And we're simply following the example that was set for us in the New Testament. And when we know that different churches, and what I mean by that is when we know that different congregations did the same thing in different locations around the world, we know that they did so by the same authority. For example, if we're reading about the church in Troas, and Paul is waiting 7 days to assemble with the saints and observe the Lord's Supper, and we also see the church in Corinth doing the same thing, and then we carried that all the way back to how the disciples continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and then Paul said, "I preach the same thing in every church." And we know that Paul is the one who gave the Corinthians instructions on the church, because he established the church in Corinth. And he even says so in chapter 11 and verse 23, I delivered to you that which I also received from the Lord. And so when we see a consistency across the religious spectrum in the first century, different congregations in different locations, all teaching and practicing the same thing on the same frequency, then we know that was God's plan for the church from the very start. And that anything other than that is to deviate from that plan. And so we have an established marker by which we can know that what we are doing is right in regard to elements and frequency. But now we're moving into a third element, and that is individual responsibility. In other words, just because a person attends a congregation that observes the Lord's Supper with the proper elements and the proper frequency doesn't make the individual right. But sometimes we have a tendency to think in those terms. If I go to a church that's doing things right, then that of necessity also makes me right. And Paul says, nope, not so. Doesn't make you right. Verse 27. He who eats or drinks in an unworthy manner. Now, unworthily or in an unworthy manner is an adverb. In other words, it's not talking about the person. It's talking about the participation. And the participation is that these Christians had, some of these Christians in Corinth had turned the Lord's Supper into a common meal. And even worse than that, turned it into a common meal whereby some Christians were shamed because they were poor. That's in verse number 22. It says, do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? So he's talking about, first of all, how they perverted the Lord's Supper in turning it into a common meal. And then on top of that, they had shamed those who have nothing in the sense that those who, the haves, they brought their meal with them, and they ate until they were full as a tick, and somebody else showed up, perhaps even later, didn't have anything to bring, and was thus shamed by those who had higher social status. And so we understand what the problem is here. And so Paul is talking about the manner of the partaking, and he's not talking about the unworthiness of the person. All right? And that's where I think, I mentioned this last week, a lot of Christians get mixed up. They think, well, if I sinned the previous week in some way, then I don't need to take the Lord's Supper this week. And they don't understand, because if a Christian sins and a Christian asks for forgiveness, that Christian's forgiven, right? The blood of Christ applies, and that sin is no reflection on their worthiness or unworthiness to partake. And so it's the manner of which they were partaking. And then verse 28, let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. And so the problem in Corinth was there was an attitude of division in the church. You shame those who have not. And so the problem was not, well, obviously there was a problem in the participation in what they were doing. But Paul points to the bigger problem is your participation is actually being caused by your attitude towards your brethren. Whereas the Lord's Supper is supposed to be a unifying event, you've turned it into a separating event. And in turning it into a separating event, then you've done this, and you further disgraced the Lord's Supper. So the problem started in the hearts of certain Christians. It manifested itself in the way that they conducted or perverted the Lord's Supper. And Paul says, a person who does that eats and drinks damnation or judgment to himself. And then look at verse number 30. This is a powerful statement that oftentimes, if this passage gets read, this part gets read over. It says, for this reason. What reason? What you've done to the Lord's Supper. What you've done to the Lord's Supper. For this reason, everything that I have laid out beginning all the way back in verse 18. Everything I've laid out in verse 18. Many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. All right, what does the word sleep mean, generally speaking, what does it mean? What's the word sleep mean? Dead. That's right. Jesus said, Lazarus is sleeping. I got to go wake him up. And Thomas said, if he's sleeping, he does well. And Jesus says, dude, Lazarus is dead. I don't think dude's in the original text. But, he had to explain it. Lazarus is dead. Right? The word sleep is a euphemism for death. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. 1 Corinthians 15, 50 and 51. So Paul says that what is going on here is so serious that members of the church were considered to be spiritually dead. Spiritually dead. I mean, they were damned because of their attitude toward their brethren. I mean, have we ever stopped to think about what that verse says in this context? You're sick, you're weak, and some of you are spiritually dead. In other words, there's no way you can possibly go to heaven with the attitude that you have toward your brethren. There's no way. Now, this is only one way that these things can be manifest. I mean, these types of attitudes can be manifest in other ways as well. It just so happens that it was manifest in the Lord's Supper in this particular case. But the Bible says it talks about these types of things in other places. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. 1 John 3 and verse 15. If you don't forgive others their trespasses, your Father won't forgive you your trespasses. Right? So hatred and unforgiveness all still boil down to personal attitudes, don't they? So this is a serious matter. And it all goes back to the hearts of those who are perpetrating this issue. And then in verses 31 and 32, he talks about how if it's up to us to judge ourselves, we're not going to be judged. Isn't that right? I'm always going to go easier on myself. I'm always going to find some justification to do what I want to do or not do what I don't want to do. So if we judge, but he says, but if we're judged by the Lord, he says, if we're truly judged, we're chastened by the Lord, that we won't be condemned with the world. Again, talking about there's no salvation in this attitude. We have to allow the Lord to correct us when our attitudes towards our brethren are bad. And then verse 33, therefore, brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. In other words, don't get you a little group to show up early and everybody eat till they're full and then wait for some others to come later who don't have anything to eat. Now, he's not talking about how to conduct their common meal. He's simply saying that the Lord's Supper is an event that is to be observed collectively by the church. By the church. Now, I do not think, although I know some by conscience do, and I respect their conscience in this respect. I know a number of faithful individuals, including some gospel preachers, who don't think it's right to offer the Lord's Supper on Sunday night. Because their conviction is that everybody needs to be there. And I think that's true. But there are some, for lack of a better term, there are some Old Testament precedents for exceptions on certain matters. For example, the Passover. You know, the children of Israel were commanded to keep the Passover in a certain month on a certain day. And in the observance of the Passover, some men came to Moses and said, look, we can't eat the Passover because we're unclean because we've touched a dead body. Now, they weren't technically unclean. They were ceremonially unclean. But being ceremonially unclean, they were prohibited from observing the Passover. And so, provisions were made. And Moses gave an exception. It says, if a man is unclean, or if a man happens to be away on a journey, and he cannot keep the Passover, and I think it's the 15th day of the 7th month, then on the 15th day of the 8th month, he can keep it. In other words, if there's something that prohibits you from taking it on the specified time, here is a secondary time that's been set aside whereby you can observe the Passover. But then he added this statement to it. He says, but if you refuse to take it when it's supposed to be taken, you don't get to take it on the second count, and you're going to be put to death. I mean, that's pretty serious, right? If you refuse to take the Passover, if you refuse to observe the Passover when you can, the second one doesn't apply. The second one doesn't apply to you. In fact, you're to be put to death for your refusal to observe the Passover. And so I think there's a precedent there that, again, and look, another thing we have to remember is this. The church at Corinth probably only met one time on Sunday. Just like every other church has for thousands of years only met one time. Look, my grandpa Burleson never went to a Sunday night service until the 1950s. He was born at Buttahatchee in 1911. And the only reason he attended a Sunday night service in the 1950s is because he moved to town and started worshiping with the church in town. And the church in town had Sunday night services. No other church way out in the county had Sunday night services. Or Wednesday night services, for that matter. You know, why do we have Sunday night services? Why do we have Wednesday night services? But particularly, why do we have Sunday night services? Now look, we don't have Sunday night services for people who didn't get a chance to come on Sunday morning. That's not the reason. We have Sunday night services because we have the ability and opportunity, and it's been determined that having a Sunday night service would be a good thing. Right? But we also understand that in the world in which we now live, some people have to work on Sunday morning. You might be in some type of service industry. You might be in the medical industry. You might be in the police or the fire department or some, something. You might have chickens. And you get, and your phone goes off on your way to church Sunday morning. All right, and so there's any number of reasons why nowadays that people can't come on Sunday morning. We have a Sunday evening service and we offer the Lord's Supper because we know it's important for those who are coming to have the ability to observe the Lord's Supper. Again, but back in the day and for about 2,000 years, nobody worried about these kinds of things because it didn't apply. Because if you didn't make it on Sunday morning, You just didn't make it. All right? And so I think it's a good thing for us to do this, to allow people to complete their worship if they're not able to be here on Sunday morning. But that's not why we meet on Sunday night. That's not it. All right? Now, one of the things that used to be done here that I had changed, I say I had changed, I wanted changed, and the change was made was, and a lot of places do this, and I don't like it, but I guess because it's an expedient, they can do it however they want, is that right before the end of services on Sunday night, they send everybody that wasn't there in the morning that wants to take the Lord's Supper to go in a room somewhere and have it. Used to be right over there, in that room right there, in the teenage classroom on Sunday night. And I thought, that's not good. Because there were a couple of times, there were times when I had to, that I might have to be over there. I'm like, this just doesn't feel right standing in a teenage classroom. Well, it just seems like it's just like I'm in there to get my check marked off. So what we started doing was having it in our Sunday night assembly. And to make it as near to the Sunday morning assembly as we possibly could, we have a song. And I think that really helps fulfill the idea of waiting on one another. Now I know what Paul meant by wait on one another. But what we're showing our brethren on Sunday night when we have that song is, we think your observance of the Lord's Supper tonight is just as important as ours this morning, and we're willing to take the extra time to make sure that your experience in taking the Lord's Supper was the same as ours to the best of our ability. And I think there's a sense in what we do helps to fulfill the wait on one another aspect of verse 33. All right. Then verse 34, he closes out. He says, if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment, and the rest I'll set in order when I come. In other words, stop this common meal nonsense in the assembly. This verse and in verse 22, do not forbid the church from eating in the church building. These verses do not forbid the church from eating in the church building. Or in some other building attached to the church building. Or even one unattached to the church building. Paul is correcting a problem with reference to the Lord's Supper. And how they had turned the Lord's Supper into a common meal. If you're going to apply this, that the church can't eat in the building in which they worship, what do you do with churches that met in people's houses? How long before or after services do you have to wait? If you eat on the front side, how much longer do you have to wait before you can have services? Or if you have services first at somebody's house, how much longer do you have to wait before you can eat in that house? I mean, it's a foolish proposition, asinine to the core. Doesn't have any. By the way, if you're going to take this to its logical conclusion, you can't eat in a restaurant on Sunday, because it says you're supposed to eat where? At home. And yet nobody I know holds themselves to that one either. If you have to eat at home. Okay. Well, you can't go out to eat Sunday after services. I mean, the inconsistency and the foolish application of this just is mind-boggling at times. All right, on page 30, the Lord's Supper must not, it's about halfway down in the lesson there. The Lord's Supper must not become a mere ritual. Now, this is oftentimes the charge that people level about the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. They say, well, if you do it every week, it loses its significance. Only if you don't care about the death of the Lord. And don't you find it interesting? If you do something every week, it loses its significance. Okay, you don't get to watch Alabama games Saturday. Because if you do it every week, it loses its significance. You don't get to play golf every day, because if you play golf every day, it loses its significance. I mean, how foolish is that? The interesting thing I find is they do every other aspect of worship every week, and none of them seem to lose their significance. Why don't you fire the preacher and save yourself some money? Because if you're going to have preaching every week, preaching's going to lose its significance. Now, I'm not advocating for that. But you see how dumb that argument is. But at the same time, it's incumbent upon every individual to make sure that it doesn't become a ritual. In other words, that heart and mind is to be engaged every time the observance is done. Look, just to be honest, almost every aspect of worship can become ritualistic. Every one of them. They can all become ritualistic. When we take up a collection, that's probably one of the fastest parts of our worship that gets accomplished in the least amount of time. But let me ask you a question. Every time you give, do you stop and think about all the blessings? Do you stop and consider all the blessings you had in the previous week? Or the blessings that you anticipate receiving this week? Because if not, your giving has become ritualistic. When you sing, do you think about all the words that you're singing? Considering the Bible teaching that is done in the words that you're singing? Do you consider that as you sing, you're teaching and admonishing everybody else in the room, and they're teaching and admonishing you? Or are you mindlessly singing the words of the songs that you've sung 1,000 times, and you're not really thinking about the words, and yet you can sing the words and sing various melody parts without singing the lead, and it can still be done mindlessly? And you know what that means? It means your singing has become ritualistic. When prayers are offered and you close your eyes and your mind goes 1,000 different ways other than what's being said in that prayer, and all you're waiting for is the amen so you can open your eyes back up and we can get on with this thing, you know what's happened? Your prayers have become ritualistic. And the same goes for Lord's Supper. The observance of the Lord's Supper is to remember how could it ever become ritualistic to remember the body and the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ? Of all the acts of worship, that should never be ritualistic. Never become ritualistic. Never be observed in some frivolous or mindless way. It has to be the Lord's Supper. It has to be the Lord's Supper. But I promise you, it's far more common than we would like to think. For many it just becomes, it's just something we do. It's just something we do. The Lord's told us that, the Lord's given us, the example to do it. It's just something that we do. It can become ritualistic, but it never, ever should. No aspect of worship should ever become ritualistic. By the way, that's why worship is difficult. True worship is a difficult task. All right, but the Lord's Supper does not become ritualistic just because it's observed every single week. All right? And then lastly, in the last paragraph, the Lord's Supper has meaning to us because the death of Christ has meaning to us. We find meaning in the supper, in His memory, to the degree that we love Him for how He died to save us. All right, and so in the bolded part says we should pray for the ability to sense the real significance of communion. That it is much more than a mere ritual. And we should pray to be able to fervently visualize the scene of the cross every time we partake. All right, so any thoughts or questions on the Lord's Supper?
I think anybody should watch the Passion.
I've thought about that, but the problem is I don't want to see Jim Caviezel every time I take the Lord's Supper.
I'd rather see the horror of what He went through.
And I get that, after I first saw the movie, I kind of felt that way, but I've gotten away from it. The one thing I try to do as a general rule is my go-to text in the Lord's Supper is John 19. It opens in verse 1 with Pilate scourged Jesus, and it finishes in about verses 30 to 34 with His death. And so, that's kind of my go-to text. It's to me, it's the most graphic description of the Lord's Supper. But I was like you for a long time, and now I'm tired of thinking about Jim Caviezel.
I don't even know who plays the Lord.
Well, it's Jim Caviezel's plays the Lord in the Passion of the Christ. So, because then if I start thinking about Jim Caviezel, then I start thinking about Frequency, which is also a great movie. All right, so any other thoughts or ideas, questions on Lord's Supper? All right, let's move down to day 19. I should be offended by this, that preaching has to share a day with prayer. Everything gets its own day, but they're going to lump preaching together with prayer. Should I be offended by that? A preacher wrote this book, so maybe not. The Bible doesn't say a lot in particular. I think this is interesting. The more I thought about this, the Bible doesn't say a lot about preaching. It doesn't say a lot about prayer. Now, just by volume of text is what I'm talking about. But what is said is, pretty important. Probably one of my favorite passages on prayer is Philippians 4. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God that passes all understanding will keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. I love that text. In everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. There's several aspects to prayer. In other words, prayer is not just a thing. Now, prayer is one of those things where the Bible speaks in a broad way and then uses that same word in a more narrow way. Does that make sense? I hate to compare it to fornication, but that's a pretty reasonable explanation. Fornication is a broad word that encompasses all sexual sins. And yet in other contexts, the word itself means something very specific as opposed to something very broad. And in the same sense, prayer has that same effect in that it can mean a lot of different things, or sometimes it can mean a very specific thing. But I think most of us think about prayer in the more, and you probably haven't thought about it this way, but you probably think about prayer in the more broad context, because when you think about prayer, you think about everything that goes in prayer. Does that make sense? Because if you think about, I say, well, what's involved in prayer? And then you're going to say, well, thanksgiving and praise, praise and thanksgiving and requests, there's all these different things that make up our prayers, and I think that's how most of us think about prayer. I made mention last week in the sermon that that reading the prayer of David in 1 Chronicles 29, 10 through 18, it made me kind of scratch my head that as I read more prayers in the Bible, they don't sound anything like our prayers with regard to their content, and in particular the praise aspect of our prayers. Now this text on top of page 31 is focused on some of the more technical aspects of prayer with regard to worship. For example, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, let's go ahead and open up there. We'll make it as far as we can in this text, on this point. Is that the Bible teaches that men are to pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. The word men is not the generic word anthropos, which means men and women. It is the word aner, A-N-E-R, aner, which means specifically a male. And so, the Bible teaches us here and in other places, 1 Corinthians 14, for example, that in the assembly, it is the place of men to pray everywhere. That we don't find any command or example, any inference that women prayed in mixed assemblies. And by the way, this is also consistent with every aspect of what we find with regard to worship. In that, that worship is a male-led process or procedure. There are no women preachers in the church. There are no women elders. There are no women deacons. So far as as far as the office of a deacon is concerned. There were no women apostles. There were no women chosen to go out in the limited commission. When Judas killed himself, women were not considered as being part of his replacement, despite the fact that Jesus' own mother was there. Now, the Bible teaches that worship is a male-led activity, and prayer, that is what we're discussing here at the top of page 31. Then you also have in verse 11 and 12 in 1 Timothy 2, let a woman learn in silence with all submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. And the reason for that is not cultural, it's biblical. Because Adam was formed first and then Eve. There's number one. The creation order is the reason. And number two, Adam was not deceived, but Eve, being deceived, fell into transgression. Reason number two. The creation order and the sin order, so to speak, is the reason for this. This is not just a matter of culture, and now that we're in the United States and things are much more egalitarian, that women can hold certain positions that they couldn't hold in Bible times. When the Bible tells us why. Now, first of all, the Bible doesn't have to tell us why. If it just tells us something, it doesn't have to tell us why. But when we have a text like this that tells us why, we ought to be double careful about dealing with it in any other way. Let me just give you an example of this in connection with 1 Timothy 2, and then we'll close. And that is in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 34. It says, let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted for them to speak, as also says the law. The law. Now I'm going to show you something. If you look that passage up in 1 Corinthians 11:14, you'd think where it says, as also says the law, that you'd have a margin note there that would point to some passage in the Mosaic law, right? Let me challenge you right now. Look in your Bibles at 1 Corinthians 14:34, and look and see if you have a margin note or a cross-reference next to the law that points you to the Old Testament. Let me save you the time. You will not find it because it doesn't exist. The law under consideration in 1 Corinthians 14:34 is the creation law. All the way back to Genesis 3:15 and 16. Now, you might have a cross-reference, but you won't have a cross-reference to the Mosaic law. If you have a cross-reference at all, it'll point you all the way back to Genesis 3, which is not a part of the Mosaic law. So this is something that has been true from the very beginning of time in men and women and their relationship with God. Okay, it is a male-led worship and prayer in general, or should I say prayer and worship in general are male-led responsibilities. All right, we'll stop right there. And jump into, next time we'll jump into the preaching.